For the better part of 5 years now, Kyoto Animation's Violet Evergarden has been my favorite animated series of all time. And my thoughts and feelings on the series have been well documented. A brilliant and masterful character study into the mind of a traumatized war veteran readjusting to society through her new job as an auto memory doll, a fancy term for ghostwriters who write and send letters for others, and coming to understand the feelings of the people around her, as well as her own feelings and emotions, and how she is worthy of love and life despite all of her self-loathing. And it's been so amazing and reassuring to see how over the years animation fans have called this the best anime of 2018 and one of the best of all time. There have been multiple threads, reviews, and even studies on Violet Evergarden from a variety of angles, from the more simple and casual way to interpret the series in a way that's most substantiated by the characters and themes directly, to the more nuanced discussions on the little parts of the series. Entire videos and interviews have been done on the series through the perspective of war veterans. Plenty have pointed out Violet's autistic coding, and there exists an entire dissertation on Violet Evergarden specifically through the lens of disability studies and Violet as a typewriter girl, which I really do recommend people to check out. It's a very insightful read. But an aspect of Violet Evergarden that noticeably less people have discussed is how the series portrays the Victorian culture it's set in, and mainly because it doesn't. The common consensus on Violet Evergarden's world as a whole is that it is definitely set sometime during the late period of the Victorian era, given the series' heavy emphasis on the typewriter, which was invented in the 1870s and was popularized especially in the 1880s. In terms of the architecture, the soldier uniforms, and especially the dresses of the actual auto memory dolls, people generally agree the series visually pulls a lot of influences from Germany, France, and Britain, but that is as far as it gets with its Victorian influences. In fact, Mackenzie Ashcroft puts it the best in her dissertation that I brought up just now, that despite the series' Victorian accents, it is ultimately a fictional yet Europe-inspired world. Culturally, nothing about the series is accurate to the era it's set in, from the technological advancements to the post-war culture to Catalia's entire existence. As such, fans have treated these Victorian elements as merely a backdrop for the story the show wants to tell. And while that's partially true, a lot of historical fiction really likes to play history like it's the modern day, I don't think that's necessarily what this show is doing. Violet Evergarden makes very little effort to accurately reflect the culture of the Victorian era, but that doesn't mean that it's not taking the culture into account. A lot has been said on the series' themes on human connection, but I think the fact that this story is set in this specific time actually enhances those themes, making Violet Evergarden a fantastic piece of Neo-Victorian fiction. And that is what the topic of this video is going to be about. I'll start off by giving a more or less simplified explanation of Neo-Victorianism, as well as a very brief history of Japan's fascination with Victorian texts to the point where it's influenced most of their culture and literary works, as well as inspiring Japan's own Neo-Victorian fictional narratives. Then I'll detail how exactly Violet Evergarden functions as Neo-Victorian fiction and how it works in dialogue with the era, taking account into the culture of the actual world it's set in and bringing up a couple of specific examples. And finally, I'll elaborate on a great focus on how Violet herself stands against the many Victorian narratives on people in her position as a quote fallen woman. But a few housekeeping things before we get started. I'm mainly going to discuss the animated series adaptation and not the original light novel, mostly because that's the version I and most people are familiar with. It's the more easily accessible version, and it's widely considered to be the definitive way to experience the story. As from what I heard in passing, people are a little mixed on the light novel. And second, this topic of how Violet Evergarden alludes to the cultural aspects of the Victorian era is so broad and packed with so much to talk about that it could honestly be its own series of videos. So I'm treating this as sort of a prelude to all of that by relaying all of the context and then only discussing the one case study. Without further ado, let's jump right in. I mentioned that Violet Evergarden is Neo-Victorian fiction, but what exactly do I mean by that? What's the difference between a story that is Victorian or Neo-Victorian? Neo-Victorianism is understood as a movement that sought to engage with the Victorian era by reimagining and rewriting the time period into contemporary contexts, which you see a lot in literature, film, and television. For example, the 2017 steampunk series Princess Principal can be classified as Neo-Victorian fiction, as it reimagines the era into a high-concept Cold War setting, which makes a certain amount of sense, as the Venn diagram between steampunk and Neo-Victorianism actually has a lot of overlap. And whether you want to argue that these kinds of stories don't actually engage with the Victorian era and simply use it as a throwaway backdrop, more often than not, that's not the case. One of the defining characteristics of Neo-Victorian adaptations and fiction is the story's ability to look back on Victorian culture and discuss the underlying issues of the time through a contemporary lens, where we have more knowledge on these subjects. Professor Imelda Welehan builds on this point in a piece she wrote about Neo-Victorian adaptations, stating our main access to Victorian periodicity on screen is through 19th century dress-ups. Our relationship to history in adaptations is one of filling in the gaps that documented history leaves, and with those additions, we recognize the weight of our contemporary concerns. These stories aren't just set in the Victorian era because the aesthetics are pretty, they take place in that time because it directly informs their plots and themes. And Japan has a great fascination with these kinds of stories. In a dissertation by Sophia Walker at the University of Chicago, she brings up how, prior to the Meiji era, Japan's borders were closed off and ergo couldn't access European artifacts from the outside. When the country reopened in 1853, one of the categories of imports that exploded in popularity were translations of Victorian texts, which were practically devoured by the population. Two of the most notable Victorian texts that kept this momentum going were Anne of Green Gables and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Anne of Green Gables garnered such massive popularity that it got not one but two animated adaptations, and while Alice has never had a straightforward adaptation in Japan, that allowed for multiple adaptations and interpretations of the story in various forms all across Japan up to modern day. A whole gobble of studies have been done on this specific story's influence in Japan as a whole, which could be further discussed at a later date. Suffice to say, this boom in Victorian texts was also supported by another factor. As said, Japan had no prior exposure to Victorian Europe, so this was the first time they really experienced this culture, which gave the impression that these were little fictitious worlds these stories were set in. Over time, this trend of Japanese interpretations of European societies slowly became its own world of meshed Japanese and European norms, which you see a lot in Japan's own Neo-Victorian stories, even to this day. Princess Principal was an example I brought up just now, and so are Moriarty the Patriot, Black Butler, and the onslaught of villainous manga and anime that I briefly glossed over in an earlier video this year, which actually leads to another point that is important for context. Historical fiction narratives in Japan tend to appeal more to female audiences, at least the ones that I am familiar with and that I know are the most popular. A lot of popular historical fiction, like Apothecary Diaries or Rose of Versailles, happen to fall under the shoujo demographic, that being anime, manga, and light novels that tend to appeal to teenage girls. And there exists a long-winded history of how shoujo media explores these historical worlds. In Shoujo Across Media Exploring Girl Practices in Contemporary Japan, one of the co-writers brings up Here Comes Miss Modern as a case study, where the story is set in the Taisho period where women are more restricted in their agency. The main character is loud and boisterous and tomboyish, representing an ideal version of the era where women do have more power and agency, and her resistance against the actual norms of the time are read as good, as opposed to how she would actually be looked at if this was the realistic depiction. Shoujo media in Japan loves to engage with these philosophical and societal discussions, and especially in historical fiction that is shoujo, we see artists and writers engaging with those eras either by portraying them accurately or going against those eras through alternate depictions. And this is exactly what some of these authors do with those Japanese-European worlds discussed earlier. It's not just a fascination with the Victorian era, these stories are still in dialogue with the era, just like any other Neo-Victorian work. Now, I know that is a lot to take in, especially with the deluge of tangents I tried very hard not to traverse, but that is Japan's relationship with the Neo-Victorian movement in a nutshell, and it's important to understand that context as Violet Evergarden is shoujo and Neo-Victorian. As such, we cannot treat the Victorian setting like a throwaway backdrop. It's not plain Victorian dress-up. It is, in fact, using the era it takes place in to further enhance and communicate its themes. The question is, how exactly? Very quickly I glossed over this with Here Comes Miss Modern, but this also applies to a number of animated works I've actually talked about in the past. One of my favorite things that stories can do is apply this neat little narrative device that I call condemnation through omission. That being, condemning a bad thing by entirely omitting what makes that thing bad in the first place to make it good. Or at least better. Some of my longtime viewers may recall I talked about something similar 3 years ago in my review on Pompo the Cinephile, which portrays the movie industry in a positive light by outright omitting greedy CEOs in favor of a leader who genuinely loves film and respects her workers, in a way condemning the current industry by removing the source of many of its problems. Similarly, earlier this year I talked about The Colors Within, which portrays Christianity in a positive light by presenting a positive role model that genuinely loves her friends, in direct opposition to many real-life quote-unquote Christians who blindly hate people who don't follow their beliefs. This is what I think Violet Evergarden is doing. In its inaccurate portrayal of the era, it actually perfectly contradicts the culture in its world and its themes. One of the many major aspects of how people lived during the Victorian era in Europe was how men and women were treated vastly differently during the time, men being out and about and taking care of politics and work, while women remained in the households and were generally socialized to be more subservient, which unfortunately you still see some of that in some areas to this day, but this was practically the norm back then. This further accentuated the ultimate characterization of the Victorian era, this being a time of Puritan thinking and extremely rigid societal norms. The expectations of women to be perfectly pure and removed of desire and agency, the expectations of every marriage and family to follow the same model of separate spheres, and the expectations of keeping any grievances or mental health issues private. Sometimes even boasting about not being able to understand any of it, as not understanding was read as better. Any deviance from these norms, no matter how small, was shunned and looked down upon by this society, which was a popular topic to explore in a lot of novels of the time, such as The Odd Woman or Lady Audley's Secret. The world of Leidenschaftlich, the country that Violet Evergarden takes place in, is almost entirely opposite of the actual Victorian world. The existence of the auto memory dolls as a female profession alone goes against the mode of separate spheres, whereas otherwise in Victorian texts like The Odd Woman, where Rhoda's business is treated as, for lack of a better term, odd, the CH Postal Company is portrayed as beneficial and crucial to this society, especially in a world where clients who require these services cannot read or write or just don't have the capacity to write an effective letter. And the ghostwriters aren't just writing reports, screenplays, or even letters of professional affairs. A large part of this series' identity is its emotional emphasis on letters as a way of communication between one human to another. A line that a lot of fans come back to is in episode 10, where Violet says there's no such thing as a letter that doesn't deserve to be delivered. The culture of Leidenschaftlich is littered with these instances of people reaching out to and being there for one another through these letters, and even through the conversations that they have in everyday life, which is largely due to the fact that the biggest difference between this world and the actual Victorian era, aside from Violet's robot arms and, again, Catalia, is the fact that the Great War happens earlier. The series is set in a reimagined late Victorian period where World War I happens earlier, and the culture that we see on screen is a culture full of post-war trauma and broken people. And none of them are really hiding it. Even in upper-class spheres like with Princess Charlotte or the Magnolia household, the characters are so open and honest about their insecurities, their trauma, how much war has shaken their lives. There are multiple discussions in the series about mental health and the human connection, and this immense honesty in how broken and messed up these people are is so unlike the actual Victorian era, where people strive to present themselves as perfect and pure and prim and proper. And you can find specific instances within the story that go against this culture even on their own. Charlotte and Damien's engagement is one that is initially posed with flowery and poetic language through their public letter exchanges, giving the impression that their marriage is prim and proper and pure, before they ultimately decide that's not their style. These rigid norms about political marriages don't work for them, so they decide to show their insecurities and hidden sides through bluntly written letters, where they find that they have actual reasons to want to spend time together that they would never have known if they weren't open and honest with one another. Iris's family situation is another good example, where we spend an entire episode with her struggling under the expectations of giving up her job and marrying a childhood friend, before she stands up for herself and declares to her family she doesn't want to get married, and she wants to keep working as an auto memory doll to eventually become the best ghostwriter, which would be blasphemy if she said that in the actual Victorian era. The series' core themes of empathy and understanding throw a wrench into this era's depiction, in a way criticizing the era it's based on. And while you can find many more examples, there are a lot, and even the two I listed could potentially be expanded on in their own subsequent videos, there is a specific angle I would really like to explore before wrapping things up, and that is how the actual character of Violet Evergarden engages with the Victorian era. One of the phenomena of the Victorian era is the idea of the fallen woman, sort of an opposite to what was expected of women, as we just discussed. One of the most notable Victorian texts written about fallen women comes at the hands of Archdeacon Sinclair, who writes about how these women completely lose their social standing and their relationships with others, even their female friends. And as expected, part of this has to do with promiscuity, attitudes of sex and prostitution, classic Puritan ideology, etc., etc. So you get the idea. And these women were tragically scorned and treated as lesser, not given a chance to be respected as human beings. In essence, they were entirely outcasts in this society. The closest thing we have to a fallen woman in Violet Evergarden is the title character, Violet. And while the idea behind fallen woman leans more towards promiscuity, there is loose connection between the outcast element and how Violet was raised as a soldier, a weapon, a tool for others to use in battle, without any regard for her individuality and agency as a human being. There still is the idea of her body being used to further the goals and power of the men around her, and even after she is discharged, she doesn't fare much better. Ashcroft's dissertation that I mentioned earlier goes into Violet's identity as a disabled person and someone who is indigenous coded, since Violet's national origin is actually not known by anyone in the series. For all intents and purposes, she herself is the outcast of Leiden Schafflick, and yet she isn't treated as such. The entire show hinges on her development as a person, on her reintegration into everyday life through her job in writing letters for people and learning about the emotions and feelings communicated through those letters. And she's supported by all of her friends and all of her clients on this journey. Violet learns so many beautiful things about life and ends up becoming the single most compassionate person in the entire cast. She puts in effort to understand the underlying emotions of others. She sobs over the lives she's taken and the families she's ruined, and she does everything to make up for her past as a tool for war. The only person who doesn't support her is Dieter, the brother of her former major, who butts heads with her in the final 2 episodes that feels very much like a true Victorian man talking down on Violet. Dieter harps on about how Violet will never become more than just a weapon, that she'll never find her place in society, that there is nothing she can do that will ever redeem her of the things she's done. And Violet turns all of that rhetoric around and says it doesn't matter what her past is, what her situation is. It doesn't matter if she can't perfectly fit into society the way Dieter believes she can't. She is still a human being with feelings and agency, and she's going to live life the way that she wants to. And where a lot of Victorian narratives have the fallen woman character meet an unfortunate end like exile or maybe even death, Violet gets the exact ending that she has longed for the entire series. The one thing Violet has wanted more than anything else was to be reunited with her Major Gilbert and finally tell him all the things she's learned about humanity, empathy, and love. Where their relationship before was defined by two soldiers on a war-torn front, this time she's able to reconnect with him as simply two civilians who genuinely love each other. This ending has had its controversies in terms of feeling like it walks back on narrative or character decisions, and also the sus ages because anime. But when you look at this from the perspective of a Neo-Victorian narrative about a fallen woman-coded character being given a chance to live normally, it's actually the perfect ending to Violet's journey. After so many years of being used and abused as a tool for the power of others, recovering from the trauma of war, learning from her peers about love and empathy, and coming to understand and accept her own individuality and worth of living, she's finally getting her own happy ending. This is beautiful as it is daring in how the show's core themes of empathy and understanding stick it to the rigid Victorian period this story is set in. It is Neo-Victorian anime operating at its finest. Violet Evergarden is undeniably Neo-Victorian fiction, and how it uses the Victorian era to further its themes is effective. There are many instances in the series, from the broader culture of Leidenschaftlich to specific character struggles and interactions, where it's in direct conflict with the culture. Specifically, we see Violet's entire story go against various narratives about fallen women from the Victorian era. This show condemns the ideas and norms of the culture it's set in by outright omitting the source of these problems. These ideas of separate spheres and perfect posy families, putting pressure on everyone to be pure and perfect. And what's the ultimate combatant against these ideas? Empathy and understanding, a willingness to connect to others, a willingness to reach out and try to understand why people are the way they are and what they've gone through and how to be there for them. People are more than the labels that others put on them. People aren't failures if they're not presented as perfectly pure. Violet Evergarden's themes and messages about the human condition intentionally clash with the Victorian times. In an era that is characterized by the belief that it's better to simply not understand, Violet Evergarden turns that around and says that it is always better to try your best to understand. I'm not going to try and hide the fact that part of the reason I made this video is because this is technically my final for my seminar class on Victorian sexuality studies, but I also feel like fans don't appreciate this side of the show enough. Aside from a select few, I see so often people disregard the setting as simply Victorian-inspired in terms of the visual front, but this series is evidently in dialogue with the era, engaging with the era by presenting an alternate reality that removes what made those times extremely difficult to live through, at least from a social standing perspective. And from this perspective, we're able to see that the best way that any of us are going to be able to get through any rough time is by collectively reaching out to one another and practicing empathy and understanding. Of course, while this project is academic, it is also my research conducted under my opinions and biases about the show, and as such, this video itself may be a little imperfect, and I have only scratched the surface on how the series engages with the Victorian era. As said, I may make more videos on this topic in the future, and especially one on the spin-off movie, which I have a whole thing on how it portrays the phenomenon of romantic friendships in Victorian culture, and how it oddly is the most accurate the series gets to portraying the time period. So I greatly encourage discussion on this topic. I'm really interested in hearing what you guys think about all of what I brought up, as well as other examples of anime that lean toward the Neo-Victorian genre in a way that engages with the era and its culture. And if you guys want me to make videos about those, I'll gladly do so. The process of getting this video together was a lot of fun, and I'm glad I was able to have the opportunity to make it. As always, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and catch you next time.